And when the sun filters down through the trees, there's no more beautiful country in the world than this water country where Olympia beer is brewed.
Remember when rock had no message, no meaning, no nothing but pure fun?
In early '87, Matt Lukin left the Melvins after Buzz declared they would be a dry band. Kurt was living with Lukin at the time, and their relationship became strained as well as he soon left. Kurt's new roommate became Dylan Carlson. Kelly Canary said, "Dylan was fucking nuts, God bless him. Once I asked him what he'd been doing, he was like, 'Oh, I realized I didn't know anything about teeth, so I went to the library and learned about teeth.'" Slim Moon remembers, one time Dylan was passed out and nobody else was home. Chris was banging on the door, but it was locked. So he crawled up the back of the house to a second stairway window, when suddenly he saw a double-barreled shotgun right in his face. Dylan always kept a gun under his bed. Kurt also was hanging out with Tracy Miranda around this time. Miranda was very knowledgeable about music and nurtured and documented the Northwest punk scene. Quote, "I had been flirting with him for quite a while," she said. "I think he had a hard time believing a girl actually liked him." In many ways, Tracy was made for Kurt. She had been to hundreds of punk shows and was willing by nature to take Kurt in and mother him in a time when he had no one and small places to go anymore. Kurt's insecurities, however, were a huge factor, and he never really felt like he deserved her. Early 1987 also marked the band's first drummer, Aaron Burkhardt. He was a metalhead who was more into getting wasted than actually practicing, which at this point drove Kurt nuts as he was getting more and more serious with each practice. In March, a friend put together a house party and scheduled the band without Kurt's permission. The show was at 17 Nussbaum Road in Raymond, Washington, and was made up of largely redneck metalheads. Compared to Raymond, Aberdeen kids were big towners. We scared the hell out of everyone. Kurt was climbing all over furniture and pouring beer all over the couch. Chris had found fake blood in the medicine cabinet and covered himself with it and was jumping out of windows. Shelley and Tracy pretended to make out with Chris, while Kurt introduced Spank Through as breaking the law. Shelley got in a fist fight with another girl over a necklace, and after the show, Chris pissed on other cars from the top of the van. Not bad for a first gig. On April 17th, the band played the midnight show on Chaos FM in Olympia. The tape was used as a demo to help them get more shows. In May, Kurt moved in with Tracy in her apartment at 114 and a half North Pear Street in Olympia. The apartment was small, but the price was right and within walking distance to downtown. Tracy was supporting them both, working the graveyard shift in the cafeteria of the Boeing airplane plant in Seattle, and as such would leave cleaning duties to Kurt. This was the topic of Kurt's song Clean Up Before She Comes. For the size of the apartment within the next 2 years, they had 5 cats, 4 rats, a cockatoo, 2 rabbits, and Kurt's turtles. Since Kurt had a tendency to write on the walls, the bathroom already had red rum written on it. They invested in rock posters, then flipped them backwards so Kurt could continue. Being unemployed, he had plenty of time to do what he loved, watching TV, playing guitar, and creating some new art project. He would create video collages out of what was on cable at the time. Ian Dixon said, quote, "He would channel surf for days. This was back when Jerry Springer was starting out and there were all these Christian channels. There was this thing they called Power TV, these Christian weightlifters that do stuff like, 'In the name of Jesus!' and smash bricks with their elbows. He'd make tapes of them and intercut them with weird scenes he'd find elsewhere on the dial. We were like, oh my god, you've done way too much acid and got way too much time on your hands." By fall of '87, matters were coming to a head with Burkhardt. They wanted to practice every night, and I'm like, "Give me a break," said Aaron. Out of frustration, Kurt placed an ad in the October 1987 issue of The Rocket looking for a replacement. When no one stepped forward, Crover helped out the band for 3 weeks so they could record a demo. On January 23rd, the band arrived at Reciprocal Studios, a small triangle-shaped building featuring a control room, a bathroom, and an isolation room with a space for 1 amp. It was falling apart, stunk, and there was no air conditioning. Jack and Dino said, quote, "It's a terrible studio. It's a terrible room, completely dead. It's carpet and plasterboard. The control room is horrible, and I can't believe I ever made a good record there." In 6 hours, the band had recorded and mixed 9.5 songs. The tape rail ran out during pen cap chew, and the band didn't want to pay the extra $40 for another reel. Kurt paid the fee of $152.44 outright with money he had made from his short-lived janitorial job. Quote, "The thing that separated it from anything else was the singing. Right off I thought, Kurt's got a real cool scream," said Dino. Before the band left, Jack approached them and asked for a copy. This is the one he passed on to Jonathan and Bruce of Sub Pop. This early in their career, Kurt knew a music video on MTV would help make the band. This took place at the Aberdeen Radio Shack. Eric Carter was the manager there and was briefly introduced before shooting began. The only effects they had at their disposal were lights and blowing cigarette smoke in front of the camera. After viewing the tape, Kurt dismissed it as too amateur. Around this time, Dale left the band again, but he suggested that they check out another Aberdeen native, Dave Foster. Kurt and Chris knew he wouldn't be a permanent replacement after meeting him. He was just too mainstream and macho for them. Quote, "He had to go to counseling. He'd get in fights and beat the hell out of people," said Chris. What finished Foster off was when his girlfriend had cheated on him, so he found the guy and beat him up. This guy was the son of a mayor, however, and Foster did jail time. This came right after Kurt and Chris had talked to Jonathan about recording a single. When he got out, Dave called up Kurt to ask when they could practice again and was told he was writing more material and he'd get back to him. What Kurt didn't say is that they had started practicing again with Burkhart. This was short-lived too, as one night after practice, Aaron asked to borrow Kurt's car to get more beer. He hit the bars by himself instead. 2 hours later, he left and was pulled over by a cop who Aaron ridiculed. Kurt's car was impounded as a result. The next morning, he was called up to practice and declined, saying he wasn't because he was too hungover. Kurt hung up on him. They then picked up a newcomer by the name of Chad Channing. They first saw Chad when he was playing shows with his band Tick Dolly Row, which featured Ben Shepherd as their lead singer. Ben later joined Soundgarden and almost was a second guitarist in Nirvana. Kurt and Chris also considered making Tad Doyle their drummer. During Malfunction's finale show at the Community World Theater, Kurt, Chris, and Chad were formally introduced. They talked briefly and agreed to jam sometime. Quote, "I just kept on coming over and jamming. They never actually said, 'Okay, you're in.'" Shortly after, they did the session for the Love Buzz single on June 11th. They worked for 5 hours, mainly on the sound collage at the start of Side A. By July 30th, Foster still believed himself to be in the band until he opened up the newest Rocket issue and found an ad advertising the band playing that very night. Quote, "I was so fucking pissed," Foster said. In late August, Kurt was called by Ponemans stating that the Love Buzz single would be the first release of the Sub Pop Singles Club. He was enraged by this, and not only had the single been taking longer than planned, and that now it wouldn't be in stores. The catch-22 was that they weren't under contract with the label, and Sub Pop had paid for the recording. They were trapped. Kurt started mailing the original Crover demo tape to various labels. His hope was to land on Touch and Go, which featured some of his favorite bands at the time, the Butthole Surfers and Scratch Acid. On September 27th, Indino mixed Spank Through for the Sub Pop 200 box set. Around this time, Bruce Pavitt called Kurt and asked if he could have $200 to press the Love Buzz single, and he was quickly hung up on. This fueled Kurt mailing out even more demos. Coincidentally, the single was finally released shortly after in November. On October 28th, the band played their biggest gig yet by opening for the Butthole Surfers at Seattle's Union Station. The show was less than stellar, but just the fact that Kurt had played a show with Gibby Haynes thrilled him. 2 days later, they played dorm room K208 at Evergreen College. Slim Moon's band had played earlier that night and a fist fight ensued. The bar had been raised and Kurt better deliver. Quote, "On this one night, he played with an intensity that I had never seen," said Slim. After finishing Blue, Kurt lifted his guitar and brought it down with so much force it splintered into the crowd. He then picked it back up and held it while eyeing the crowd. Then up in the air it went again, and Kurt walked out the room. Quote, "He never explained why he freaked out, but he was smiling," said John Perky. "I was talking to him after the show, and the guitar was lying there on the floor, and people kept grabbing pieces of it." By late '88, people on the outside started noticing Seattle. Mudhoney had released Superfuzz Big Muff and had attracted attention from Sonic Youth, who offered to do a split with them, which resulted in the Touch Me I'm Sick Halloween split. Soundgarden was being signed by A&M, and legendary DJ John Peel was starting to notice. Nirvana had, however, only just started to take off. When the Love Buzz single was finally released, Sub Pop called Kurt to let him know of its completion. Daniel House, who worked at Sub Pop at the time, said Kurt insisted on hearing it on the stereo. Quote, "We played it for them, and I don't think I ever saw Kurt happier." The band took 100 of the singles for themselves. Kurt dropped one off at KCMU in hopes they would play it. When Tracy picked Kurt up from Seattle to head back to Olympia, it still hadn't been played. They traveled further and further south and almost out of range of the signal when he made her pull over to a gas station and finally called in to request it. After a half an hour, the single finally came through the car speakers. Quote, "He sat there hearing himself coming out of the radio with a big smile on his face," said Tracy. By December, kids were still talking about the dorm room show. Whenever he'd show up at the Smithfield Cafe or the Spar Coffee Shop, college kids would whisper amongst themselves, and some asked him to play parties. None were paying, but at least they were asking. The Rocket reviewed the Love Buzz single as, quote, "one hell of a first effort," but stated the obvious in that it would be overshadowed by the success other bands on the label were having at that time. The single featured photo shots by Alice Wheeler, taken back during that summer at Point Defiance Park and the Tacoma Narrows Bridge. Quote, "I was having technical difficulties. I didn't have a good camera. The pictures are infrared, so they're kind of fuzzy," said Alice. For Christmas that year, Kurt gave copies of the single to everyone in his family. Upon hearing it, Wendy said he needed something else to fall back on. On December 28th, the band played the Sub Pop 200 release party. The Love Buzz single had done so well that Sub Pop started to talk to Nirvana about an album. At the end of the year, they returned to Reciprocal Studios to start sessions on Bleach.
I forgot just what I need.